The chair at the end of the table was already gone when I walked into the room. Not pulled out, not saved, just missing. My mother kept talking like nothing had changed, her voice steady, polite, careful. Someone passed the bread. Someone laughed a second too late. And no one asked why my grandmother wasn't there. I sat down anyway, folding my hands in my lap, feeling like I'd arrived after a decision had already been made. They spoke as if something had ended, as if I was supposed to understand. My name is Emily Carter, and that was the night I realized I had never been part of the plan. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever felt betrayed by your own family, hit like and subscribe. These stories don't always get told out loud, but they live quietly in a lot of homes. You're not alone here. I didn't always understand that chair. For a long time, I thought it was just furniture. When I was 6, my mother packed my clothes into 2 black trash bags. Not suitcases, trash bags with twisted handles that cut into my fingers when I tried to carry them myself. She said it was temporary, just until things settled, just until she and her new husband figured things out. Margaret Collins didn't ask questions when I showed up at her door. She just took the bags from my hands and set them by the stairs. Her house smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times, and whatever she'd cooked the night before. Usually eggs, sometimes soup. Always something cheap, always something warm. That house was small, drafty. The heat clicked on and off like it was arguing with itself. But when Maggie said, "You can take the bedroom by the window," she said it like it was obvious. Like there had never been another option. I learned early how to be quiet there, how to fold my homework on the kitchen table while she rubbed her knees and watched the evening news. The sound of her fork against the plate was steady, comforting. Every other weekend, my mother would drive me back to her new house. The drive was 40 minutes long and always silent. The house itself was bright and cold. Everything matched. Everything smelled new. At dinner, I sat at the smaller table in the kitchen. They called it the kids' table, even when I was 16 and taller than my mother. Plates were paper, cups were plastic. The adults laughed behind the closed dining room door. One Thanksgiving, I remember hearing my stepfather raise a glass. "To my family," he said. I stared at the cranberry sauce sliding around my paper plate and wondered which part of that sentence included me. My Aunt Becky had a way of smiling that made you feel smaller without touching you. "You look healthy," she'd say, her eyes moving over my thrift store jeans. "College isn't for everyone," she told me once, like it was encouragement. When I graduated high school, Maggie cried quietly in the back row. My mother hugged me stiffly afterward, already distracted by the twins tugging at her sleeves. I learned then not to wait for recognition, to take care of myself. That instinct followed me into adulthood. I worked through college. I took the first job that paid me enough to survive. Chicago was loud and expensive and indifferent, but I learned how to disappear into it. Maggie stayed where she was. The same house, the same creaking steps. She still turned the thermostat down at night to save money, still cut coupons with careful hands. I noticed the changes before anyone else did. The pauses at the bottom of the stairs, the way she pressed her palm to her chest when she thought I wasn't looking. When I mentioned it to my mother, she waved me off. "She's fine," she said. "She's always been dramatic." Maggie never said she was in pain. She just moved slower. She reused tea bags. She watched the lights like they cost her something personal. I didn't know then how much she was hiding. I didn't know how long she'd been counting pills. I didn't know how carefully she'd trained herself not to ask. But I did know this. When Maggie said my name, it sounded like it mattered. And when my family said hers, it sounded like an inconvenience. I didn't know it back then. But that difference would come back to haunt all of us. By the time I was in my 30s, the pattern felt permanent. Not cruel enough to call abuse, just quiet, just consistent. My mother learned a new language somewhere along the way. Therapy words. Soft words that sounded responsible. boundaries, self-care, emotional labour. She used them the way people use curtains, to block the view without admitting there's something behind them. When Maggie called, my mother rarely answered on the first ring, sometimes not at all. "She worries too much," she'd say later, scrolling through her phone. "It's draining." Becky was worse because she was precise. She never raised her voice, never missed a birthday post on Facebook. She just framed neglect as logic. "At a certain age," she once said over brunch, "quality of life matters more than length." She said it while stirring her latte, like she was talking about produce. I started paying attention to the small things. The unopened mail on Maggie's counter. The way she apologised before asking a question. The way she'd say, "It's nothing," and then sit down hard like her body had given up on pretending. I offered to go with her to the doctor. She hesitated, not because she didn't want help, because she didn't want to be a problem. "They all have lives," she told me. "I don't want to be the reason anyone feels guilty." That word stuck with me. Guilty. Not concerned, not worried. Guilty. The holidays made everything clearer. Christmas meant photos posted online, smiling faces, matching sweaters, captions about gratitude. Maggie and I were never in the frame. One year, I asked my mother why Maggie hadn't been invited. "She doesn't like driving," she said, "and honestly, it's a lot for her. We're doing her a favour." Maggie never said that. Maggie never complained about distance, or noise, or effort. She complained about one thing only once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table. "I don't want to disappear," she said quietly. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed. Then came the group chat, the circle. My mother named it herself, a place to keep everyone connected, to share updates, to plan birthdays, to check in. In practice, it was a performance. People talked around each other, shared articles, gave advice no one asked for. When Maggie texted that she was short on her heart medication, the response came fast. Just not the kind she needed. Generic brands, insurance appeals, budgeting tips. Josh sent a link to an app. Becky asked if the doctor had discussed alternatives. No one sent money. No one said, "I've got it." And then Maggie stopped responding. I didn't realise at first that she'd been blocked. I just noticed the silence, the way the chat kept moving without her. Planning meals, joking, coordinating an engagement brunch I hadn't heard about either. When I finally asked my mother what happened, she sighed like I'd asked something unreasonable. "I needed space," she said. "For my mental health." Space from her own mother. That was when the fear set in. Don't panic, not anger, something colder. I drove out to Maggie's house the next day. She was sitting in the dark, wrapped in a sweater, the TV volume low. "Trying to save electricity," she said, smiling like it was nothing. On the table were her pill bottles, lined up. Neat. One was almost empty. "I'll make them last," she said. "I'll cut them in half." The room felt too small for my lungs. I remembered the chair. The table. The way decisions happened without asking. I didn't argue with her. I didn't tell anyone. I went home and opened my bank app. And for the first time, I understood exactly what it costs to stay human in a family that has decided you're expendable. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of everything that followed. I bought the medication on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen counter with my coat still on. The pharmacy app spun for a second longer than usual before the total appeared on the screen. $487 and some change. 3 months' supply. I stared at the number like it might blink first. My rent was due in a week. My fridge held a half carton of eggs and a jar of mustard. I had been spacing out my groceries, walking instead of taking the train, pretending that being tired was a lifestyle choice. I pressed confirm anyway. The confirmation email arrived instantly. I felt nothing at first. No relief. No panic. Just a strange calm, like I'd stepped off something tall and was waiting to see if the ground would come up to meet me. When I told Maggie the pills were coming, I lied. I said I'd found a coupon, a friend of a friend. Something easy. She thanked me very much, promised to pay me back. Her voice cracked on my name. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The group chat kept moving. Recipes, wine suggestions, a reminder about the engagement brunch. Maggie's name never came up. A few days later, I found out she hadn't been invited to the brunch. Neither had I. The photos appeared online before anyone mentioned it. White tablecloths. Sunlight. Champagne flutes. My mother's arm around Becky's shoulder. Someone commented, "Family is everything." I stared at that caption longer than I should have. When I asked my mother about it, she didn't deny anything. She just reframed it. "It was last minute," she said. "We didn't think you'd want to make the drive." She said it kindly. That was the worst part. That night, Maggie asked if I wanted pancakes for dinner. She'd found a box in the back of the pantry. I watched her measure the batter carefully, like wasting an extra spoonful might tip something fragile. Her phone buzzed once while we ate. She glanced at it, then turned the screen face down. "Spam," she said. It wasn't. The next escalation came quietly. An email forwarded to me by accident. Becky meant to send it to my mother. It landed in my inbox instead. It was a link. A brochure for a state-assisted senior facility. Highlighted. Annotated. The subject line read, "Options." I read it twice before my hands started shaking. When I confronted Becky, she didn't get defensive. She sounded relieved. "You're emotional," she said. "That's understandable. But this is practical." "Practical for who?" I asked. "For everyone," she replied. That was the moment I realized this wasn't neglect. It was planning. I started keeping records, screenshots, dates, times, who said what and when. It felt dramatic at first, paranoid. But something in me knew better. I'd spent my whole life being told I misunderstood. I wasn't making that mistake again. Maggie didn't know about the emails, or the facility, or the quiet discussions about her needs. She just knew people had stopped calling. One afternoon I found her sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights off, sorting mail. "I don't want them to worry," she said when I asked. That word again, worry. Please do not modify it. Not responsibility. The real break came when Josh texted the group chat. He didn't know I was watching closely now. "Maybe it's time to look into something more structured. For her safety." No one disagreed. My mother replied with a heart emoji. That night, Maggie told me she felt like she was fading. Not dying, just fading. Like if she stopped speaking, no one would notice for a while. I sat in my car afterward and cried until my chest hurt. Not because of what they were doing, but because I finally understood why. They weren't cruel. They were comfortable. And comfort has a way of erasing people quietly. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let them finish the job. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm I didn't choose. Work during the day, Maggie's house every night, groceries calculated down to the cent, gas receipts folded into my wallet like warnings. The medication helped, but it didn't fix everything. Maggie still moved carefully, still paused before the stairs, still apologised when she asked me to stay a little longer. I started noticing things I couldn't ignore anymore. Her voicemail box was full because no one left messages. Her landline rang twice a day. Telemarketers. The calendar on her fridge still showed last month. No appointments, no visits. When I brought up the idea of rotating care with the family, the response came fast. "I don't have the bandwidth," my mother said. Becky sent a paragraph about burnout and caregiver fatigue. Josh suggested a checklist. No one suggested themselves. Then came the message that changed everything. Not in the group chat, a private text. Sent to the wrong person again. It was from my mother to Becky. She's not managing well. We should move before something happens. Move. There was no concern in the sentence, no urgency, just strategy. I drove to Maggie's house in the rain that night. The windshield wipers squeaked like they were tired too. She was sitting in her chair, blanket pulled tight, watching a game show with the sound off. "They think I don't notice," she said before I could speak. I froze. "Notice what?" She turned and looked at me fully then, clear-eyed, present. The way they talk around me, the way they decide things without asking. She reached into the drawer beside her chair and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside were printed emails, notes she'd written in the margins, dates circled. "I've been paying attention for a long time," she said. I felt something break open in my chest. Not fear, relief. She hadn't been confused. She hadn't been imagining it. "They think I'm tired," she continued. "That I'll go along with whatever makes them comfortable." She smiled then, not warm, not bitter, just certain. "I raised you better than that." We didn't talk about next steps that night. We just sat there, listening to the rain hit the windows. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel suffocating. 2 days later, my mother called. Not texted, called. Her voice was sweet, almost rehearsed. "We want to help," she said, "but this situation isn't sustainable." I asked her what she meant. She said, "We're worried about liability." That was the word. Not safety, not love, liability. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday, at Maggie's house. Everyone insisted it would be easier that way, more comfortable for her. Becky offered to bring documents. Josh asked if he should prepare anything. My mother said we'd talk it through calmly. They thought this was an intervention. They thought they were being generous. The night before the meeting, Maggie handed me a list. Names, dates, account numbers, a lawyer's card taped neatly to the top. "Just in case," she said. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator knock. My phone buzzed with reminders I couldn't afford to ignore. Rent, utilities, everything pressing in at once. I realised then that this wasn't just about Maggie. It was about who got to decide whose life was inconvenient. They thought the hard part was over, that she was cornered, that I was tired enough to step aside. They didn't know what we had been preparing, and they had no idea how much the room was about to change. The room looked smaller once everyone arrived, not because the walls had moved, but because of how they filled the space. My mother took the armchair closest to the window, coat still on, like she might leave early. Becky set her folder neatly on the coffee table, squared the corners. Josh hovered, phone in hand, already distracted. Uncle Tom stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, pretending neutrality was a position. Maggie sat in her usual chair, upright, dressed carefully, hair brushed. The lamp beside her cast a warm circle of light that didn't quite reach the rest of us. No one asked how she felt. "We just want to talk," my mother said, folding her hands the way she did when she wanted to sound reasonable. "About options." Becky nodded. "Planning ahead," Josh added. "For safety." They spoke in turns, smooth and practiced. Assisted living, liability. What if she fell? What if something happened when no one was there? They said her name a lot. They didn't speak to her. Maggie listened without interrupting. She didn't fidget, she didn't argue, she waited. When Becky slid the paperwork forward, the sound of it against the wood felt louder than it should have. Guardianship forms, consent language, places already highlighted. "That's not necessary," Maggie said quietly. The room paused, just for a second. My mother smiled, tight around the edges. "Mom, we're just trying to help." "Help who?" Maggie asked. No one answered. That was when I stood up. Not suddenly, not angrily. I just rose from the chair like it had always been my turn. "I think we should slow down," I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. Before we decide anything for someone who's sitting right here. Becky exhaled sharply. Emily, you're too close to this. I'm the only one who's been here, I replied. Josh looked up then. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked. I reached for the remote on the coffee table and turned on the TV. The screen lit up, bright against the dim room. Messages appeared, one after another. Time-stamped. Familiar words, stripped of context and suddenly sharp. Options. Move before something happens. She's not managing well. No one spoke. My mother stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. Becky's jaw tightened. Josh shifted back in his seat. I didn't know, Uncle Tom muttered. Maggie cleared her throat. I did, she said. She leaned forward then, hands steady on her knees. I've known for a while. She turned to Becky. You talk about quality of life like it's a spreadsheet. To my mother. You talk about boundaries like they don't apply to me. To Josh. You talk about safety because it sounds better than convenience. Each sentence landed clean. No shouting, no drama. I'm not confused, Maggie continued. I'm not helpless. I'm just inconvenient. The silence that followed was heavy, not shocked, exposed. That's not what this is, my mother said weakly. Maggie smiled, just a little. Then sign up, she said. Becky blinked. Sign up for what? For care, Maggie replied. 20 hours a week, each of you, rotating, cooking, appointments. Nights. No one moved. Josh laughed nervously. That's not realistic. Neither is pretending you care, Maggie said. The lawyer stepped forward then. Daniel Harris. Calm. Professional. He'd been waiting in the hallway just out of sight. I think this is where I come in, he said. My mother's face was drained of colour. He explained the trust, the no contest clause, the documentation Maggie had prepared, quietly, patiently, over months. Every detail accounted for. Every attempt at control was anticipated. You won't be making decisions for Mrs. Collins, he finished, unless she asks. The room shifted, not loud, final. I watched my family realise, one by one, that the ground had moved. That the power they assumed was theirs had never been guaranteed. Maggie reached for my hand. Her grip was firm. The meeting's over, she said. No one argued. As they gathered their coats, I noticed something small. The chair at the end of the table. The one that had been missing before. It was still empty, but this time no one expected us to fill it. They left quietly. No slammed doors, no raised voices, just coats pulled on, folders tucked away, eyes avoiding the lamplit circle where Maggie still sat. The room felt larger once they were gone, like it had been holding its breath and finally let go. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. Life continued, unimpressed by anyone's intentions. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the table and opened my laptop, not to reread messages, not to catalogue evidence, just to look at the calendar, the bills, the future as it actually was, rent due, work emails unanswered. A quiet, stubborn resolve settling in my chest. Over the next few days, my phone stayed silent. No apologies, no explanations, just the absence of people who had mistaken access for authority. I noticed how light the silence felt, how it made room for things I hadn't let myself imagine. Maggie moved through the house differently now, not faster, not stronger. Just sure. She taped a new list to the fridge, appointments, names, a reminder to water the plant by the window. She asked me what I wanted for dinner and waited for the answer. The lawyer called once. Brief, confirming details. He didn't sound triumphant. Just prepared. One afternoon, Maggie handed me a folder. Not thick, neat. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't seen yet. foundations, allocations, instructions written in her careful handwriting. "Not today," she said when she saw my expression. "Soon." That night, I lay awake listening to the radiator knock and thought about all the ways people confuse patience with weakness. About how quietly plans can grow when no one is watching. They thought the worst had passed. They thought survival was the end of the story. They were wrong. They had given us time. And time, I was learning, can be the sharpest edge of all. If you've ever sat at a table where decisions were made without you, if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, I want you to know this story isn't as rare as people pretend. It just doesn't get talked about. So if this feels familiar, if parts of it sound like your life or someone you love, subscribe and stay with me. Not for drama, but for recognition. For the quiet understanding that comes from being seen. Because some stories don't end when the meeting is over, and this one isn't finished yet.